I'm 34 years old now, and for most of my life, I've been the quiet one in my family, the dependable one, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and never asked for recognition. I grew up in a small suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Trimmed hedges, a white porch swing, framed family photos lining the hallway. Inside, though, there was a hierarchy everyone understood without it ever being said out loud. At the top was my older brother, Daniel. Daniel was 2 years older than me. Confident, charismatic, the kind of man teachers praised and neighbors trusted instinctively. My parents called him driven. When he spoke, people listened. When he failed, it was explained away as bad luck. When I succeeded, it was framed as help I'd received. I was a younger sister who did well quietly. I worked hard because I had to. Daniel worked hard because he wanted to be admired. That difference shaped everything. I learned early that my role was to support, not challenge, to smooth things over, to forgive first. When Daniel forgot to pick me up from school, my mother said, "You know how busy he is." When he borrowed money and didn't return it, my father told me, "Don't keep score with family." Those were the subtle red flags, the tiny injustices that didn't feel worth naming at the time. By the time we were adults, the dynamic had calcified into something heavier. Daniel became a junior partner at a mid-sized real estate development firm downtown. I worked as a compliance analyst for a regional bank, unglamorous, behind the scenes, focused on documentation, audits, and risk mitigation. My parents bragged about Daniel's big deals. They described my job as stable. At family dinners, Daniel dominated the table with stories about negotiations, acquisitions, legal maneuvering. I noticed how often the language overlapped with things I knew deeply: escrow timelines, fiduciary duties, disclosure requirements. But when I tried to add context, he'd smile indulgently and say, "You wouldn't believe how complicated it gets." Everyone laughed. I learned to stop speaking. If you've ever been underestimated, let me know in the comments. The real power imbalance emerged after our mother suffered a minor stroke. It wasn't devastating, but it scared everyone enough to force conversations we'd been avoiding. Estate planning, medical proxies, contingencies. Daniel volunteered to handle things. "I'll coordinate with the attorney," he said, confident as always. "Make sure everything's streamlined." I offered to help. I worked with legal documents every day. I knew how easily small errors could become big problems. Daniel waved me off. "It's fine. I've got it." My parents agreed. They always did. Over the next year, Daniel slowly inserted himself into every financial aspect of their lives. Joint accounts, property titles, power of attorney. Each step was presented as protective, responsible. He framed himself as the shield between them in a complicated world. And I let it happen, because confronting him meant confronting the family dynamic itself, and I wasn't ready for that. The first sign that something was wrong came quietly. I was reviewing internal case files at work when I noticed a familiar name attached to a flagged transaction report. It wasn't a client. It was the name of the trust my parents had established years earlier, tied to a rental property they owned outright. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. Then I saw the address. My parents' property. The transaction itself wasn't illegal, but it was unusual. A reallocation of funds through a shell LLC. The authorization signature belonged to Daniel, acting under power of attorney. The documentation was technically valid, but thin. Too thin. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. At work, we're trained to separate personal emotion from professional judgment. But we're also trained to recognize patterns. And this one felt wrong. I didn't report anything. I didn't even mention it to my supervisor. Instead, I printed the publicly available filings and took them home, spreading them out across my kitchen table like puzzle pieces. That night, I barely slept. The next family dinner was tense for me in a way no one else noticed. Daniel talked about a pending acquisition, joked about how exhausting adult responsibilities were. My parents laughed, proud. I watched him carefully. When he caught me looking, he raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," I said. But something had shifted. The discovery moment came 2 weeks later when I asked my mother a simple question about the rental property. "Oh, we sold it," she said casually, stirring her tea. My heart skipped. Sold it. Yes. Daniel said it was a good time. The market. When? She frowned, thinking. A few months ago, I think. And where did the proceeds go? Another pause. I'm not sure. Daniel handles that now. That was the moment the floor dropped out from under me. I asked to see the paperwork. My mother hesitated, then said Daniel kept the files. I called him later that evening, my voice steady despite the adrenaline pounding in my ears. You sold the Maple Street property? I asked. Yeah, he said easily. Why? Mom didn't realize it was finalized. She signed the authorization. Everything was legal. Where's the money? A pause. Fractional. Calculated. It's being reinvested, he said. You wouldn't understand the structure. That old dismissal again. I pushed. Daniel, that property was supposed to fund their long-term care. I know what I'm doing, he snapped, the edge showing now. Stop acting like you're the only responsible one. That was the initial confrontation. It ended with him accusing me of paranoia, of jealousy. He told my parents I was confused by my job, seeing risks where there weren't any. And they believed him. The emotional low point came fast after that. Within weeks, Daniel restricted my access to family financial information entirely. He framed it as reducing stress for our parents. When I tried to raise concerns, my father told me, "You're overstepping." I started questioning myself, wondering if I really was projecting professional paranoia onto personal matters. Then the lawsuit arrived. A former business partner of Daniel's filed a civil claim alleging misrepresentation and improper fund commingling. The filing named multiple entities, including the LLC that now held my parents' former property funds. And then my name appeared, not as a defendant, but as a witness. Daniel called me immediately. This time, his confidence felt forced. Don't worry, he said. It's nothing, just procedural. What does that mean for Mom and Dad? I asked. They're not involved, but they're assets. I said it's handled. 2 days later, a process server showed up at my apartment with a subpoena. I was required to testify regarding financial oversight and document retention related to the LLC. Daniel had put himself forward as the primary authority, and me as collateral. That night, sitting alone at my kitchen table again, surrounded by documents I'd quietly begun collecting, I made a decision. I stopped trying to convince my family. Instead, I started preparing. Quietly, I requested public records. I reconstructed timelines. I pulled archived emails from years ago, messages Daniel had sent me casually, asking questions about compliance procedures, documentation standards. At the time, they'd seemed harmless. Now they were context. I consulted an attorney, not to sue, but to understand my exposure. She listened carefully, flipping through my organized folders. You've been meticulous, she said finally. How long have you been doing this? Since childhood, I replied without thinking. She looked up. That may matter more than you realize. What happened next changed everything. But before that, tell me where you're listening from. The courtroom date was set for early spring. Daniel grew more confident as it approached, not less. He spoke loudly about how frivolous the case was. He joked about ambulance-chasing lawyers. He reassured my parents with practiced ease. And every time he did, I added another file to my growing archive. Because there was one document I hadn't mentioned to anyone yet. One file I'd saved long before any of this, back when being invisible felt safer than being seen. A file that explained everything. And soon, the judge would ask for it. The morning of the hearing arrived with an eerie calm. I woke before my alarm, the gray light of dawn filtering through my bedroom blinds. For a moment, I lay still, listening to the hum of traffic outside, grounding myself in the ordinary sounds of a weekday morning. I made coffee the same way I always did. Black, no sugar. Muscle memory steadied my hands. Daniel thrived on spectacle. I survived on preparation. By the time I reached the courthouse, I already knew the layout of the room from public records photos and prior hearings I'd quietly observed weeks earlier. I knew where the judge would sit, where the plaintiff's counsel would stand, where witnesses would be sworn in. And I knew exactly what Daniel thought this day would be. He thought it would be a performance. He arrived 10 minutes late, suit perfectly pressed, tie expensive but understated. He greeted his attorney with a firm handshake, laughing loudly enough for people nearby to hear. When he saw me seated alone on the wooden bench, he offered a smile that felt almost affectionate. "There you are," he said. "Try not to look so nervous." I didn't respond. That silence unsettled him more than any argument ever had. Inside the courtroom, the case unfolded slowly at first. The plaintiff's attorney laid out a narrative of misplaced trust, blurred boundaries, and financial opacity. Daniel's counsel countered with confidence, framing everything as aggressive but lawful business strategy. Daniel testified early. He spoke with assurance, using the cadence of someone used to being believed. He explained the LLC structure, the asset transfers, the reinvestment strategy. He portrayed himself as a responsible son, shielding aging parents from complexity. When questions turned toward me, he smiled again. "My sister works in banking," he said, glancing briefly in my direction. "She's very detail-oriented, sometimes to a fault." A soft chuckle rippled through the room. He implied I'd misunderstood, that I'd been emotional, that my concerns stemmed from sibling rivalry rather than fact. I watched the judge closely. She didn't smile. When I was called to the stand, I told the truth plainly. I explained my role, my lack of authority, the documents I'd reviewed. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I answered only what was asked. Daniel grew more animated as the hours passed. He interrupted once, then twice, before his attorney placed a calming hand on his arm. Confidence had tipped into impatience. That's when the judge leaned forward. "Mr. Daniels," she said, addressing Daniel directly, "you've referenced extensive documentation supporting your actions. Yet several disclosures appear incomplete." Daniel nodded quickly. "We provided everything requested." The judge tapped her pen against the bench. "Not everything." She turned to me. "Ms. Daniels, you mentioned earlier that you retained personal records related to your brother's inquiries over the years." "Yes, Your Honor." "How long have you kept them?" I swallowed. "Since I was a teenager." The room stilled. Daniel's head snapped toward me. The judge's voice remained even. "Do those records include communications relevant to this LLC's formation and operation?" "Yes." A pause. Deliberate. "Please submit the file." My attorney rose and handed the clerk a thick label binder. The cover was unassuming. No dramatic title, just dates. Daniel leaned back in his chair, still smiling, but the color had drained from his face. Inside that binder was the file I'd been saving since childhood. Emails, texts, notes, requests Daniel had sent me over the years, asking how to bypass certain reporting thresholds, how to structure transfers to avoid scrutiny, how to justify reallocations without triggering alerts. Each question had been framed as hypothetical, educational. Each answer I'd given had been careful, cautious, by the book, and every exchange was time-stamped. The judge flipped through the pages slowly. Daniel's attorney whispered urgently in his ear. For the first time, Daniel didn't look at the judge or his lawyer. He looked at me. As the implications settled, I felt something unfamiliar bloom in my chest. Not triumph, not anger. Relief. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing. The questioning resumed, but the tone had changed. What had been theoretical became specific. Dates aligned. Language repeated. Patterns emerged. Daniel's earlier confidence now worked against him. Each assertion was cross-referenced. Each denial confronted with his own words. The overconfidence became the escalation point. He tried to explain context, claimed misunderstanding, suggested he'd relied on professional advice. The judge listened patiently. Then she asked one final question. "Mr. Daniels," she said, "why did you represent to this court that you alone manage compliance, when these communications show long-term reliance on your sister's guidance?" Silence. He opened his mouth, closed it. The answer, whatever it might have been, never came. The ruling wasn't delivered that day. Civil cases rarely resolve so cleanly. But the consequences began immediately. The judge ordered a forensic audit, independent oversight, temporary asset freezes. Daniel's authority over the LLC was suspended pending review. My parents sat in the back row stunned. After the hearing, my mother approached me, eyes wet. "Why didn't you tell us?" I met her gaze. I tried. No one deserves to feel invisible in their own family. The months that followed were quieter, but heavier. The audit uncovered exactly what I'd feared and hoped not to find. Funds diverted under the guise of reinvestment, commingling between business and personal accounts. Just enough irregularity to erode trust, not enough to scream fraud. Until everything was laid side by side, Daniel settled out of court. Part of the agreement required relinquishing control of all family-related assets. Another clause mandated reimbursement to the trust with penalties. His firm placed him on indefinite leave. The golden child image cracked, not with a scandalous explosion, but with a slow, undeniable collapse. At home, the power shift was subtler. My parents didn't apologize outright. They didn't suddenly see me differently overnight. But they began asking questions, listening, letting me speak without interruption. Daniel stopped calling. Weeks later, he sent one message. "I never thought you'd do this." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I never thought you'd put me in that position. Would you have handled this differently?" I didn't feel victorious. I felt lighter. I moved my parents' assets under independent fiduciary management. I removed myself from any role that could blur boundaries again. I recommended therapy for all of us. They went once. Maybe they'll go again. Daniel and I no longer speak. Sometimes people ask if I regret it, if exposing him was worth losing a brother. The truth is, I lost him long before the courtroom. What I gained was something quieter but more enduring: self-trust. Invisibility can teach you to observe, to document, to prepare. It can become a weakness or a strategy. I chose the latter. Sometimes walking away is the strongest move you can make.